Welcome to the 55th episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. I'm Max Rudolph, and today Dave Ingram and I will be discussing anti-ERM beliefs, where roadblocks are thrown up in an effort to halt or invalidate an enterprise risk management project. Dave will share his initial thoughts, and then we'll each share some examples we have seen during our careers. Our aim for these Crossing Thin Ice offerings is to help with your ERM program and general risk knowledge. We encourage you to share with anyone interested in lifelong learning about risk management, and we welcome your feedback. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We're here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds. Let's get started.
In the Crossing Thin Ice podcasts, we usually focus on the positive value of ERM and on ways to make ERM more effective. But anyone who's worked in the risk management field has at one time or another, possibly just yesterday, heard one or more complaints about ERM. Last year, we featured an article about risk management beliefs. So let's call today's topic the anti-ERM beliefs. The things that some people believe that invalidate even the idea of spending good money to do something like ERM, that, if successful, only claims to reduce the likelihood of outsized losses. So here are 5 anti-ERM beliefs that we think are common. First, ERM is unnecessary bureaucracy, a compliance burden that detracts from value-enhancing efforts. ERM processes can be inefficient and divert attention from core business activities. The administrative load of ERM may outweigh its benefits, especially if it is an add-on activity not integrated into normal workflows. And second, ERM is too complicated to understand or implement effectively. Often, an ERM framework comes with a complete, detailed rulebook with a new vocabulary and a complicated measurement system that is completely new to the company. This complexity results in flawed implementations, with staff going through routines that they do not necessarily understand. Number 3, risk management slows down innovation and decision-making. A new emphasis on risk mitigation can lead to excessive caution, hindering innovation and the ability to seize new opportunities, especially when staff has been trained to focus on just one objective. Risk management processes impose constraints that delay decision-making and make it easy for folks who do not want additional work to stifle creative initiatives. Number 4, we already have talented people who know how to manage risk without formal processes. Existing personnel possess sufficient risk management capabilities, so formal ERM frameworks are just redundant. And number 5, we've operated successfully for years without a formal ERM framework. Organizations with a history of success without formal risk management will question the necessity of adopting ERM. The risk management leaders, which consist of the chief risk officer and the executive sponsor of ERM, need to approach these complaints carefully, mainly because the facts underlying these anti-ERM beliefs are often at least partially true, and mostly because the folks who are expressing these beliefs believe that they are true. Here's a 6-point process to respond. First, validate the complaint. Most often, risk management leaders go wrong on this first step by arguing that the ERM program is just fine. The response to a serious complaint needs to be first to take the complaint seriously. You should also determine how widespread this complaint can be heard. Is the source just one person or an area of the company, or are there multiple people in different areas having the same complaint? Second, investigate the source. Find out the specific situations that are driving the complaint. Are they situations where people are following the ERM program and that is causing a complaint? Or are the situations where people are not actually following the ERM program but are acting in the name of ERM? Third, make changes where needed. Based on the findings of the investigation, you should be deciding between making changes to the ERM program requirements or making changes for how people need to act to support the ERM program. Fourth, track the progress. It is important that in this process you identify something that you can track to show that A, something is actually being done, and B, it is having an impact on the sources of the original complaints. Fifth, revise the ERM story. Now you need to adapt the ERM story. That story should include the adapted processes, with emphasis on that story depending on how significant the changes were and how broadly the original complaint was felt in the organization. The revised story may also include special mention of a risk culture belief that runs counter to the original complaint. And sixth, tell the new ERM story. Finally, this story has got to go public. You'll have chances to tell this story, sometimes in one sentence, other times in 3-sentence elevator speech, and very rarely the full 2-paragraph version. You have to have all 3 committed to memory and ready to go whenever you get the opportunity. For example, if we get the complaint that we operated successfully for years without an ERM program, you can look into that. What you're likely to find is that some areas did have good risk management practice, and some other areas were just lucky. And a few areas with spotty risk management actually did have problems. The adjustment that you can look into might include lightening the new additional ERM load on areas with long-standing strong risk management, adding further training for the formerly lucky, and digging into the prior problems to look for learning opportunities that may not have been shared at the time that there was a problem. The new ERM story can emphasize that ERM is comprehensive and that learning from our experiences is a very important aspect of ERM. Under our recent theme of fitting ERM to the company, you need to take a hard look at the ERM requirements in comparison to any other set of rules that the company lives under. ERM needs to be similar to other requirements within the company. Otherwise, it becomes the nail that is sticking up. And as the proverb says, that nail will be hammered down.
Dave, what are some additional anti-ERM beliefs that you've encountered beyond those that you mentioned?
Well, Max, I actually have a list of 20 of these in total. So, but I'm not going to burden you with the whole list. Let me give you 3 more. The first of those would be that ERM demands resources that could be better spent on immediate priorities without having any clear proof of its value. And it's that last part I want to emphasize here, that proof of value argument. It comes up quite a bit. And in my mind, it's a completely spurious argument. The person who's asking this probably has in mind a value calculation that they learned in business school or something about a discounted cash flow. But the typical discounted cash flow calculation takes likely projected cash flows and does a present value calculation. Pretty simple. In many cases, the cash flows are treated as if they're certain. And the discount rate might reflect risk, but if it does, it's usually just the general level of risk of the organization. Risk is not really a factor, or at least not the risk of the thing that you're valuing is not a factor in the calculation at all. So it's sort of like asking somebody to tell you how long it takes them to drive to work, but don't factor in traffic jams at all in that. So it's kind of unrealistic. When you do include risk in the determination of value, you get what's called a risk-adjusted value. The adjustment by taking in risk into account is generally a decrease in the value compared to that calculation I just described. So if you think of an imaginary project you're looking at to value there, and that project has a 1 in 4 chance of having a 0 return, you wouldn't get a very useful answer if you only evaluated the 3 out of 4 times that you did get a return out of the project. Risk management has a positive impact on that risk-adjusted value, though, in many cases, maybe in most cases, because it includes actions that'll decrease the amount of potential losses or reductions in income, or it'll decrease the likelihood of those losses. And then you can compare the cost of the risk management program to the improvement in risk-adjusted return to look at the value of risk management. The second anti-ERM belief is another one that I've heard many, many times, which is, if leadership isn't prioritizing ERM, why should I? My answer to that is that, well, leadership is probably pretty busy. They have a lot of responsibilities. And in most cases, I would agree that leadership shouldn't be making ERM their top priority. All businesses have two things that should be higher priorities. The first priority needs to be having customers or sales. If you don't have customers or sales, then you just don't have a business. And every business has to have something they do or make that somebody out there finds that they need. And the second thing that they need to have is a profit. A business without the ability to deliver their product or service at a cost that's lower than what the customers are willing to pay is doomed. Even if the cost is just a little bit more than what they can get, it'll be a slow death. Customers or sales and profits are obviously higher priority than risk management. Once you have customers and once you have profits, then your business potentially has a value. And it only has a value though if that's a repeatable process. If you can come back next month, next year, and do that again. And you get into that thing we just talked about, a discounted value. If you do have a value, then it makes sense to adopt risk management and increase that value in the way we just described about increasing values. So if leadership is not out there actively and publicly championing ERN, it's probably because they believe they need to concentrate their limited attention on one or both of those two top priorities. But I would answer to the person who's saying that originally, they did appoint me, the risk manager, to carry the ball on risk management. And they are paying me a salary. So that shows that they do believe that risk management has some value. Once a quarter, they actually devote some of the board's time to risk management. I do believe it is something that's important to them. The third one I'll mention is one that you hear a lot, especially in newer companies and startups, which is that our culture thrives on taking big risks, and ERM would just slow us down. And I'd say to that a couple things. First of all, ERM is not the risk prevention department, and it's not in charge of preventing new things from happening. It's not avoiding risk. It's about supporting smart risk taking. ERM shouldn't be slowing things down, except to the extent it slows them down just enough to look at them. So a well-done ERM framework will enhance agility. And in fact, if you have an ERM framework that you actually practice on a regular basis, it gets more and more efficient to do that kind of gut check on things. If you only take out ERM and use it occasionally, yes, it does seem like it's awkward and slows things down. But if it's just a normal part of your business process, it doesn't. Max, I just gave three of these anti-ERM beliefs that I've heard. Have you ever heard any?
Yeah, Dave, since you shared three, I'll do the same. And I think as I'm listening to your three, I think the three that I picked interact with those three a little bit too, which is kind of interesting to think about. One that I've gotten a lot over the years is that detractors will say, well, regulators impose enough constraints. We don't need to add more internally. I heard this one for 15 years when I would try to convince insurers that a pandemic was inevitable and could impact them in ways that included mortality and morbidity, but also credit risks, supply chains, and liquidity. They would say, why should we listen to you when the major consulting firms and medical experts don't seem worried? At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, it seemed like insurers preferred not to have any knowledge in advance. If they could argue that no one could have known the extent of the crisis, then they could react with everyone else. Going forward, given that we've seen pandemics hit back to back in previous centuries, I will readily admit that I'm on my soapbox again and no one is listening. The White House once again is closed its Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy. And my fear is that those who studied the 1918 outbreak took away from the responses that ignoring a virus and not counting the sick or dead accurately, it's the best way to deal with it since people don't realize until later when they're out of office that it was a problem. Considering these types of risks qualitatively really doesn't take much time, but it adds lots of value. And I would encourage people to think that through. A second comment that I have heard many times is focusing on risks means we miss opportunities for growth. This fails to recognize that having an eye on risk can maintain growth while also reducing the risk of a negative event. This monitoring process can avoid future distractions that may even threaten solvency. Over the years, I've pushed back against those who price variable annuities with a single deterministic scenario, assuming that there was no volatility. Long-term care managers who could not imagine interest rates below 8%, and most recently, leveraged loan salesmen telling me that defaults would be about 10 basis points. Historically, teams I led reduced exposure to residential mortgages in 2006 and avoided equity exposure to companies where risk culture seemed to be taking a back seat. All this from a corporate area, not a pricing area. Part of the risk team's job is to identify risks and their implications before they blow up. But constantly we hear peers doing their best Chuck Prince impression, saying, as long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. I disagree and encourage margins of safety around capital and cash flows. You could argue that this is a satisficing strategy. I would rather be surprised in a positive way as growth opportunities are researched. Finally, people say to me, risk ownership belongs to individual departments. They say that the incentive compensation system will lead to good decision making, and if it doesn't, then the line manager will be fired. What they forget is that the business written by that manager's poor assumptions, let's say for a life insurance block, may remain on the books for decades in a best case scenario. And a worst case scenario with poor underwriting causes an immediate spike in claims, whether it's life, health, or property. Those left behind have to clean up the mess. There's not a single ERM template that defines a successful process. Risk culture, senior management, and board leadership, along with buy-in from risk owners and their staff, all need to align. An ERM team needs to work with these groups to help them understand their important role in managing risks aggregated across the enterprise. By having a risk team focus on risk interactions and aggregation, using transparency and consistency, and aligning with the risk tolerance and culture, an entity can better manage risks and make better strategic and tactical decisions that in some cases turn risks into opportunities. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.